Hey everyone, and welcome back to this series where I'm helping you transition from the world of Power BI to the world of Microsoft Fabric. Today, we're going to be looking through this document here. I've produced this and it's 9 pages long, and it's specifically to give you guidance for designing end-to-end data solutions for your organization in Microsoft Fabric. Because what I've found is that there's two kind of coexisting observations. Number one is that there are infinite different ways in which we can configure Microsoft Fabric. It's a very, very flexible tool. There's lots of different options at each stage in your data pipeline, whether it's getting data, storing data, serving data, building semantic models. There's lots and lots of different options. And I would say that there's no real best way of using Microsoft Fabric. Really, it's dependent on your organization. Every organization has different requirements. Your data is stored in different locations, different source systems, each with different security kind of configurations. You've got different budgets, different skill sets in your teams. All of these things make it really difficult to kind of prescribe one architecture that you should follow. I have a lot of people in my community here on school.com/Microsoft-Fabric. They're asking me, what do you think of this architecture? And it's quite difficult to provide advice without really understanding your business, because you need to understand the specific context of your business to be able to make good architectural decisions. So the original plan for this video was to build an end-to-end project that drew together all of the lessons learned from the last 5-6 videos. But when I was planning that video, I thought what would actually be a lot more valuable for you if you're planning out end-to-end architectures in Microsoft Fabric is to come up with a decision-making framework that you can apply to your organization. And what this document is a list of 36 questions that you can ask of yourself and of your team and of your organization that's going to help you think about the right things when you're designing data infrastructure in Microsoft Fabric. So this document provides some of those questions. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just a bit of a guide about some things that you should consider at each stage when you're planning out your solutions. There's probably many areas that I haven't covered. And if you can think of something very important that I haven't covered, then leave a comment below and I'll definitely add it in. I'm thinking of making this kind of like a live document. So as kind of new information comes in, new features are released, or best practices start to emerge, then I'll be updating this document as well. Now you can download this document completely for free. It's on the school community and I'll leave a link in the description. As with all of the videos in this series, I've got resources and things that you can follow. Like here's the PDF for this module. Direct Lake mode, it's got an IPython notebook that you can download. The validation series had a number of notebooks as well. And when I launch this one, it will include this PDF completely for free, so you can use it in your organization. So the document is structured following the similar structure to how this series has been structured. So it's going to step you through a logical kind of path of decisions that you need to make. Number one is around structuring your tenant. So thinking about capacities, workspaces, security, access control, and that stuff. Then we'll look at getting data into Fabric. And for each of these, we're going to be looking at a number of questions. So between like 3 to 10 questions for some of these sections that you need to ask yourself. Storing data in Fabric, building semantic models, and validating your data and semantic models. So let's start with structuring your Fabric tenant. So this is going to be the first thing really that you need to get right when you're designing a new architecture or a new solution in Microsoft Fabric. This is just the sample capacity and workspace design from the documentation. And one thing to note here, I'm going to be going through these relatively quickly because there's 36 questions in total. So I want to do 30 seconds to a minute on each just to make sure that the video is kind of not too long. Now, each of these I've mentioned in detail in my previous videos, and where relevant, I've tried to link to that specific point in the videos earlier in the series. So if you want more information, you can look at those videos there. So let's start with number one. Do you have requirements to keep data stored in a specific geography? For example, to comply with GDPR. So if you have customers, you need to keep their customer data within the EU, for example. The capacity is what defines where your data is stored. So if you create a capacity in West US, your data will be stored in West US. If you create another capacity in Paris, France, your data will be stored in Paris, France. And obviously this has a pretty big implication over complying with regulations. So you need to get that right. Do you want to separate your data processing, kind of data intensive stuff with your Power BI reporting? So if yes, then you might want to have separate capacities for these as well. And what about billing? Because billing can have an impact on the capacities that you design as well. So in some larger companies, they might want separate capacities for different departments so that they can have like ring-fenced budgets for this department. Maybe a finance department is going to have a separate capacity and they can be billed via the finance department, whereas your consultancy division might have their own capacity that they can use. And obviously these capacities can have different SKU, different levels of resources assigned to them, and therefore different costs associated with them. Now the next one is, what is the planned intensity of your workloads? And are you willing to wait for the completion of certain workloads? So the SKU level of your capacity determines the amount of compute resource that's available to you. So data intensive workloads like ingesting a lot of data, high volume of data, or training machine learning models for like 4 hours or more, that's going to use up a lot of your compute resources. So if you're on an F2, it's going to start throttling your capacity. It's going to make it very difficult to use if you're doing a lot of these intensive workflows. So if you do have kind of data intensive workloads, you've got a lot of data, then you're going to be wanting to use one of the higher capacities to crunch through that data in a lot shorter time to free up your capacity to do, I don't know, report serving or anything else that you want to do in your capacity. Next, we move on to workspaces. And workspaces is a bit complex. This is probably the area that there's the most kind of creativity or different ideas about how you should architect different workspaces. So some guiding questions when thinking about your workspace design are, which groups of users need access to which Fabric items? So as I mentioned, the workspace is the primary way that we can restrict access to items in Fabric. So it's worthwhile thinking about who needs access to what, and create logical groupings of people like your data scientists, your data engineers, your BI analysts, your BI consumers. Think about grouping like personas in your organization and then perhaps creating workspaces for each of these groupings, or at least giving access to workspaces based on these groupings. Do you have requirements for separating dev, test, and production workloads and the data stored in data stores as well? Because this is going to have an impact on your workspaces. You might want to split out different workspaces for dev, test, and production. And relating to the above, do you have any requirements for version controlling your Fabric items using the Git integration? Git integration is done at the workspace level, and then you kind of select items within that workspace that you want to be source controlled. But it's done at the workspace level, so that can affect your workspace strategy. There's more information in this link here. Now, finally, one thing that we mentioned in our video on capacities and access control was around data pipelines. So if you're going to be using data pipelines, then you need to be careful when you consider some of the constraints that exist around cross-workspace reading, writing, and triggering other notebooks, store procedures, all of that kind of stuff. And I've linked to the specific section in the YouTube video where I've mentioned that in more detail. Next, we move on to security and access control. So this is obviously very, very important. This is the high-level representation of the Fabric security architecture, linked from the documentation. So what are some of the guiding questions that you need to ask yourself around security and access control? Well, we've touched on this a little bit previously. What are the core groups of users who need access to your solution? The core groups of users. And as we mentioned, it's always a good idea to create Entra ID security groups that manage your access via groups rather than giving individuals access to a workspace or individual items, because this can get very messy very quickly and it's difficult to manage and maintain. Do you have requirements for row level security? Now, row level security can be managed at the data warehouse level, but propagation to kind of downstream items is currently working on that feature, that capability. It's what's called one security, and that's coming soon in Microsoft Fabric. So just bear that in mind if you're considering row level security. You're probably going to be thinking, where do I do row level security? Is it in the data warehouse, or is it in the semantic model, which you might be familiar with already? So that is a bit of a question mark currently around one security, and they're going to make that a lot clearer soon. Now, I've put a bit of a catch-all here, like, do you have data stored behind firewalls and virtual networks, accessible via private endpoints, all this kind of stuff. Now, in the last few weeks, Microsoft released a lot of features around this kind of security and accessing private data behind firewalls to help you access this data from inside Fabric. And I haven't mentioned a lot about that yet on the channel in this series. But if that is your situation, your requirements, then there's a lot of really good documentation here that you can follow. Just goes through to the security page, which is kind of the top level page. And then underneath this, there's a lot more information about how you can do all of these different things if your data is secured, maybe in Azure or different cloud services or even on-prem services as well. So next we're going to move on to getting data into Fabric. So some initial guiding questions here really depends on where your data is stored. So is your data stored in ADLS Gen 2, Amazon S3, Google Cloud Storage, or the Dataverse? And if yes, you can use shortcuts. If your data is stored in Azure SQL Database, Snowflake, Cosmos DB, then you can use the new feature database mirroring. So that's only released this week at the Fabric conference in Las Vegas for public preview. So that's an option if your data is stored in any of these three. Is your data stored on-premise? So if so, you can use either dataflow with an on-premise data gateway, or you can use the new data pipeline on-premise access feature functionality that again they released only a few days ago at the Fabric conference. And I've linked to some documentation about how you can achieve that as well. Are you ingesting real-time event data? So if that's the case, then you can use the event stream. Now, these 4 cases are ingestion methods or ways of getting data into Fabric that have specific features designed for them to make it easier. Now, if you've got data living in any other system, then you're going to want to be doing plain old data ingestion, ETL, right? And to do that in Fabric, there's 3 main tools. So there's the Dataflow, Gen 2, the data pipeline, copy activity, and the Fabric Notebook. Now, choosing between these, which one you want to use, is dependent on these questions. So you might want to consider if you already have pre-existing Power BI Gen 1 data flows, then it's a fairly easy process to kind of port over that logic into a Dataflow Gen 2. And there's a tutorial on how to do that linked here. And related to the above, what's the current skill level of the people in your organization who will be creating these ETL items? If it's predominantly no or low code users, then probably going to want to be using data flows or data pipelines. If you have data engineers who are comfortable using Spark, Python, Scala, those kind of languages and frameworks, then you're probably going to be wanting to use a combination of data pipelines for the orchestration part and Fabric notebooks for the transformation part. Another one I put here is, are you going to be connecting to REST APIs with complex authentication or pagination or all of these kind of more complex APIs that we can interface with? And if it's yes, then it's probably best to use a Fabric notebook because you can get really good control about where you're passing tokens and when you're passing them. So I'd definitely recommend that for REST APIs. Another consideration is the data accessible using a Python client library? So some of the big SaaS providers like HubSpot, they have Python client libraries that you can use to really easily authenticate with their APIs and their data, and it kind of abstracts away the logic. You just authenticate with their client service and you request a data set in one line of Python. So if that's an option, if you're using a SaaS provider that has a Python client library, again, you can do that within a notebook. Now, the final one I put here about getting data in is, do you want your ETL jobs and your items to be version controlled? So this is now available for the data pipeline, and I've linked to where you can learn more about that, but it's not currently available with the data flow. So if you want to be really tightly version controlled on your ETL stuff, your data pipelines, it's possible now with your data pipeline. Data flow, I'm sure, will come in the future. Notebooks, you can also version control as well. So next we move into choosing a data store, and I did a long video about this as well. So if you want more context, then go to this video here. But once you've selected a strategy for getting data into Fabric, you need to select where you want to store it in Fabric. And there's 3 choices. There's 3 different data stores that are available to us: the Lakehouse, the data warehouse, and the KQL database. And as with all these things, there's pros and cons of each, and they're designed for slightly different use cases and slightly different personas in your organization. Now, a few questions to get started when selecting an individual data store for a specific task. Well, is your data structured, or is it semi-structured or unstructured? So is it in tables, CSV, JSON? Is it image data? Is it audio data? The Lakehouse files area is the only location in Fabric where you can store files, so semi-structured or unstructured. So if that's your requirement, you're going to be wanting to use a Lakehouse. And typically a Lakehouse is used to get these files from external systems, then transform them and load them into some more structured format into a Lakehouse table. If you're storing real-time event data, then you're going to be wanting to store that in a KQL database, at least initially. Now you can route that data into a Lakehouse as well, either at the same time or after the event for more long-term storage, and if you want to integrate it better with Spark for kind of machine learning, time series forecasting, all of that kind of stuff. But at least in the kind of the bronze layer, you're going to be wanting to use the KQL database. Now, number 24 here is what are the skill sets of your team? So if you're predominantly SQL based, then the data warehouse is obviously your best bet, which is a transactional data warehouse. If you have Python or Scala data engineers, then the Lakehouse offers a lot more flexibility for you. And related to kind of the skill sets is, do you want to make use of the low and no code functionality and features available in Fabric? Because in the data warehouse, you have visual queries that you can use for data transformation, data querying, and that's one of the easiest methods. The data wrangler is another feature that's available in Python notebooks, in Fabric notebooks, so they can interface with your Lakehouse data. Now this basically gives you some code in a no/low code way. I would still argue it helps to know a bit of Python to understand what that code is then doing before you execute it. But that's another option if you want to use the data wrangler and you want to use Python in notebooks. Finally, we're going to look at the version control point again, because this is where some of the data stores differ slightly. So the Lakehouse and any notebooks that you create can be Git controlled. It can be integrated with a Git system. Currently, it's only Azure DevOps, Azure repos, but they are introducing GitHub integration soon. So currently, Git integration is not available for the data warehouse, although this should be coming soon, I imagine. And you can actually achieve something similar if you set up your data warehouse and you manage your data warehouse through a SQL project. So that was looking at individual data stores. How do we select the right one for the right job? In practice, what you're probably going to be wanting to do is create more than one data store and combine them in some sort of coherent architecture. So here's some of the questions that you should think about when you're combining multiple data stores into one architecture. Are you planning on following the medallion architecture? So typically here, the bronze layer in Fabric will be a Lakehouse. If you're going to be dealing with flat files, CSV, JSON, all of that kind of stuff can be stored in the files area, and then you can transform it into the Lakehouse tables area. Now it is possible to not use a Lakehouse for the bronze area, but you'd have to do all of your transformation before you load it. So you can query a REST API from a dataflow, for example, or a data pipeline using the web activity. And then you can perform some sort of transformation on that data and load it directly into a data warehouse. So it is possible to use a warehouse for your bronze layer, but if you want to keep a record of those incoming files, you want to be doing that in a Lakehouse. We've talked about if you're ingesting streaming data, you might want to add a bronze KQL database to store that. It has a lot richer functionality for time series, analysis, and storage as well. Now in the silver and the gold layer of a medallion architecture, that can be either a Lakehouse or a data warehouse, depending on, as we mentioned, like the skill sets in your team, your preferences, the types of workloads that you're going to be doing on it. And one of those workloads is around building and serving machine learning models. So if that's what you're going to be doing, any sort of data science workloads and modeling and experimentation, EDA, exploratory data analysis, that's best done from data in a Lakehouse. So if you're going to be doing machine learning, data science, really you want your typically silver layer to be a Lakehouse. Number 29 is, do you have requirements for row level security, object level security, or dynamic data masking, or column level security as well? Now, these features are typically really only required in that gold layer where you're serving it up to some semantic modeling. And so a typical pattern is to make your gold layer a data warehouse, because the data warehouse is the only object where you can do all of these features in Fabric, like your column level security, dynamic data masking. So as it gets closer to the business user, that's where you want to start controlling more rigorously who can access what. Next, we move on to building semantic models from your data. And again, I've linked to the video where I explain this in a lot more detail. We're going to be talking you through these quite quickly, but if you want more detail, then check out this video here. Now there's 3 connection modes to choose from when you're connecting to data in Fabric to build semantic models. Now we've still got the import mode and the direct query mode, and we've got the new option to create direct lake connection mode models. So I just wanted to talk about a few questions when designing and selecting a semantic model connection mode. So if you're going to be using views in your semantic model, SQL views from the data warehouse, then you're not going to be able to benefit from direct lake. So if you've got SQL views, then it's going to fall back to direct query mode. So just bear that in mind. Can I still use import mode? Well, you can technically, yes. And there's some scenarios where that might still be useful or a good decision. So if you don't need real-time updates on your data, which direct query and direct lake provide, if you don't really need that, then there's no reason why you shouldn't pick import mode. Or when you want to control over when that data refreshes. So in some instances, you might not want users to see real-time information. You might want them to only get data once per day or once per hour, for example. Another option where import mode might still be a good idea is that when your data size is really small, it can fit easily into a Power BI model, you can query it very easily. You're not talking like gigabytes and petabytes where some of the direct query and the direct lake mode become more useful. So if that's not a constraint that you have around data size, then again, that could be an option. Another question here is around, do you want to combine data from multiple data stores of the same type into one semantic model? So currently a direct lake model has to read from one data store. So if you want to use direct lake, you can only do that from one data warehouse, for example. Now you can, from Power BI Desktop, get data from different data stores, for example, one Lakehouse and another Lakehouse, or one warehouse, another warehouse. I think they have to be the same type, but you can do this using direct query and just going on get data, getting data from Fabric and selecting multiple. It's going to force you to use direct query, but I think it is possible. Next up, we want to talk about validating your data and your semantic models. A really, really important point that I think is worth going over again. So some of the questions that you might want to consider at this stage are, well, do you have a pre-existing data quality tool that you might want to use, and does it integrate with Fabric? So if you've already got a lot of data quality testing set up in some sort of third-party tool, then you want to check whether that integrates with Fabric. And if the answer to either of those questions is no, then you might want to look at some of the open source tooling that's available through the Python libraries, the Python frameworks like Great Expectations, because these can be accessible through Fabric notebooks. And I did a long video kind of looking at how you can integrate Great Expectations into Fabric notebooks to validate each of these different file types. Next, what skill sets do you have in your team? So if you've got predominantly SQL users, then you can build validation rules either directly in your warehouse using stored procedures, although that's maybe not recommended, or you can use third-party tools like dbt. If you've got Python developers, then you can use open source Python frameworks like Great Expectations, or Pydantic, for example, is another one, but I recommend Great Expectations because it allows you to do testing of all of these different data types, incoming files, tables, data frames, semantic models very easily, and it allows you to do kind of enterprise level data monitoring as well. Now, what are the most important data sets and columns within those data sets in your organization, and how can you validate them? Okay, i.e., if there's a problem X with column Y in dataset Z, my reporting/analytics or machine learning is going to be impacted. So here we're getting a bit more fine-grained. You need to think about, what are the really important data sets in my organization? And within those data sets, what are the really important columns? Okay, so what are the columns that have a big impact on my downstream analytics? Maybe I'm building a whole report based on this date column. Okay, it's like a time series analysis. And so if that date column is of poor quality, then that's going to really impact the validity of my outcomes in my analysis. So how are we going to validate that? What are the different ways in which that column could potentially go wrong? And how can I build tests to make sure that that column is always of good quality? Do you want to monitor data quality across all data sets in your organization? So we've talked in the video previously about enterprise-wide monitoring of data quality. And for that, I definitely recommend you use Great Expectations. If you're going to look towards open source technologies, definitely recommend Great Expectations. So that was it. Thank you very much for reading. I hope that wasn't a too long video. We've gone through 36 questions to help you design data infrastructure, end-to-end solutions in Microsoft Fabric. If you found this useful, please write a comment on the YouTube video, because it definitely helps more people find the video and helps the word get out there. If you've got Power BI developers or people in your organization that are making these decisions about building and designing end-to-end infrastructure in Fabric, make sure you share it with them. Now, I do have one more video in this series. In the next video, I'm going to be taking a step back from the kind of more technical elements of the transition from Power BI to Microsoft Fabric, and I want to get a bit more personal. So specifically for you, sitting at home, you're thinking about your career options over the next few years. Maybe you're a Power BI developer now, but now you have a whole new world to kind of explore and step into potentially if you want to. And I'm someone that has kind of made that journey myself. About 6 or 7 years ago, I moved from building Power BI reports to focusing more on data science and data engineering, and data architecture. So I do have a few comments that might be valuable to you if you're thinking about moving from being a Power BI developer personally in your own career to some of the roles that exist within the Fabric ecosystem and the Fabric environment. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.